Good morning, and thank you all for being here. So we should start by saying that it's the unboomer's birthday. It's Kelly's birthday tomorrow. But she decided to be with us today, so thank you for doing that. So the panel is going to discuss equity, and I think all of us, we think about embedding equity and inclusion in organizations, which is basically becoming an increasingly popular but really important and a priority discussion for nonprofits. There's all kinds of new research and learning how to structure our policies and practices to support this work. And there are many leaders, though, struggle to maintain the momentum towards really achieving it. So this session, we're going to explore the gaps between our aspirations and our reality and share strategies to build those pathways to developing effective organizational practices that move us forward in a more diverse way and a more diverse and equitable sector. So our panel, wonderful panel, starts with Kelly Bates. She leads the strategies direction for the Interaction Institute for Social Change, which is in this building, and supports its dynamic team of consultants and trainers focused on social change and equity. Kelly's a change agent, civic leader, and lawyer, and for more than 20 years has led numerous organizations to promote collaboration, equity, and civic engagement locally and nationally. So welcome, Kelly. Shahir, how you doing? Well. All right. Shahir Mustafa is a very famous guy. He's married to this really famous woman. I won't call her name. He's the president and CEO of Hopewell, which is the largest nonprofit provider of comprehensive foster care in Massachusetts and Connecticut. He also teaches at the Institute of Nonprofit Practice, IMP, at Tufts University, Tisch College of Civic Life. He's the vice chair for the Children's League of Massachusetts and previously served as the leader of the Child Protection Services across 31 cities in Greater Boston through the Department of Children and Families. He has a master's in clinical social work and is certified as a diversity practitioner. So thank you. And all the way from Oakland, California, we have Sonia Bashiva Magnon. Dr. Magnon has more than 25 years of experience in higher education, nonprofit, and government administration. She's the second executive director of Leader Spring Center, which is in Oakland, California, and was the initial director of the Lawrence and Isabel Barnett Center for Integrated Arts and Enterprise. She's associate professor of arts administration, education, and policy, and affiliate faculty in Latinx studies at the Ohio State University. You have to get that right? Yeah. She was the Simpson Endowed Professor of Community Arts and Executive Director of the Center for Art and Public Life, and is the founding chair of the Community Arts major at the California College of the Arts. So welcome to all three of you, and thank you for coming. So we're going to start by asking them all personal questions. Kelly, how old are you? No, I'm sorry. So basically, just to think about on a personal or professional level, one of your first experiences in terms of realizing how the difficulty of putting equity and inclusion into practice. So we'll start with Kelly.
A request. Can we move this a little? I can't see these lovely people over here. Does this podium move a little bit off to the side? Just so we can see you. Thank you. Ah, wonderful.
Thank you.
Great. Well, first of all, I'm turning 50 tomorrow, because I'm about claim your age. Claim it. Claim it. This story is when I was 26. I was leading my first nonprofit, and I was so excited. I was 26 years old. It was a women's organization in Boston. I had just finished law school. Everybody was going to law firms, and I was like, no, I'm going to go do social justice work. And it was a really incredible experience. And I remember thinking, we're going to do this differently, right? I'm Irish American, I'm African American. We're going to have an incredibly diverse workforce. We're going to be really aiming towards social justice. And so I actually hired a deputy director who was this incredible woman who had so many skills. And she was Brazilian, and she was older than me. And I thought this was going to be a perfect reality, right? Like we were going to just change everything together. And it was an epic fail, because what we didn't realize is even though we were people of color, there were a lot of other interpersonal cultural challenges that were happening between us. There was the age dynamic. I was younger and I was leading the organization, and she wanted power for herself and also to share power. And it was difficult for her to take leadership from me as a younger person. And we had totally different ways of interacting culturally. She was from Brazil, I was from New York City, and it was different. And it was really tough. And we often, had to deal with a lot of challenges. And to make a long story short, even though we both had these incredible ideas and we were very passionate about each other and the mission, in the end, we split apart. And the organization split apart because they didn't know how to hold two wonderful, women of color leaders to lead around our mission. And they were afraid to touch what they thought was a lightning rod of supporting us. And instead, they left us alone. And the organization actually fell apart some years after that. And so it was a lesson of, even as we do this work, and we do it at IASC, we work a lot around racial equity work in organizations. Even within organizations led by people of color, there are deep challenges that we have to deal with. Not to mention the fact that even though we want to lead differently, in a lot of ways, the organizations have been led before us by leaders who have a different way of operating. And we're stepping in, trying to lead in our unique ways and finding that really difficult. So I wanted to just share that story because I want to lift up that, we often think about challenging contexts between people of color and white people in organizations and sort of dominant culture and how that affects the culture, but also there are real issues that happen between people of color in nonprofits and in social justice that, we need support around and we can't leave people on their own with.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Try that again. So I would probably echo a lot of things that Kelly just mentioned, but I guess I would highlight what I would like to think was a success. So it was when I first started working at the Department of Children and Families. So I was 33 years old, and I was hired as the area director of 2 different offices at DCF. And at the time, I was one of 3 area directors in the entire state that were of color. I was by far the youngest. And also, I was the only one who was hired from outside the DCF system. And so all the kind of, just the intersectionality of all of that was something that was very prevalent for me. And I also kind of went into that situation saying, I want to come in and I want to make a positive impact. The department has incredible power to affect people's lives, and it absolutely needs to have an equity lens. DCF has the authority to literally reconstitute families, and that is a profound power, and it needs to be wielded with great care. And so when I came in, I had a lot of ideas about how to do that. And the offices that I was responsible for, I was the only person of color amidst 18 supervisors and managers, and again, half the age of some of the people that I was supervising. And it was a tough environment. It's a union environment. It's a tough culture. If anybody ever has worked for the department, it's a very misunderstood organization. There's kind of like a bunker mentality that happens. But at the end of the day, the people that I saw working there were really good people with great intentions, but I think some of the impact they were having obviously was not so great. And I was challenged quite a bit, flagrantly, very disrespectfully in many times. And I had to kind of check myself because there was a time where I wanted to lash back out, right? I wanted to use my power and kind of put people in their place and say, no, you're not going to disrespect me like that, for my own kind of efficacy to be able to, move forward. But at the end of the day, I knew that ultimately would not be effective. And I think that's really the conversation that we need to have is, my dad used to say, do you want to be right or do you want to get the job done? And there was a lot of times where, I really wanted to be right, but that would not have gotten the job done. And so I think there was something about checking my own ego and making sure that I was pushing for something greater than myself, which is the families and the kids that are impacted by the department on a daily basis. So we saw great disproportionality represented in the child welfare system. And even though all the folks that I was working with would say, I'm not racist, we don't have racist policies, we don't have racist practices, the way that I ultimately was able to kind of help move the needle a little bit was to point to the data. And the data said otherwise. Then how come we're having disproportionate impact on communities of color, if that's the case? And that was the window in. That was the that was the vehicle to get people to start to see that, okay, maybe we can think differently and practice differently. So we've got a long way to go. It's not, it wasn't a miracle, but I think we did move the needle. And now that progress is continuing. The offices that I was responsible for now have the highest rate of kinship placement in the entire state, which means that kids are placed with family more in those two offices than any other office in the rest of the state. And now it's become a model for the rest of the Commonwealth. So it can be done. We still have a long way to go, but it can be done.
Good morning, Sonia Magnon, and I can basically ditto everything that my colleagues have said. Everything from entering into the workforce at a very young age, right out of college, and experiencing questions, about my professionalism, questions about who I was. With a name like Sonia Magnon, you don't know who's coming in the room until you see me. My parents are Dominican, and a lot of assumptions are made, by the color of my skin. And for folks that don't believe there are Afro-Latinos, there are all over the world. I think my experience, my aha moment was when I entered the academy. I have close to 25 years teaching at 3 different institutions, a private arts college in California, a private liberal arts college in Middletown, Connecticut, and then a very large Research One institution in Ohio. And at all 3 institutions, a lot of what I brought to the table was really questioning who was leading departments, who was leading an administration. I was fortunate to be in very key positions at all 3 universities, vice president at Wesleyan University, right next door in Connecticut. And a lot of what I was looked to do was bring an equity lens, not only to curricular initiatives, but in hiring practices, in admissions and retention. And a lot of what I saw was exactly the same thing at all 3 institutions. There's a lot of talk about equity and diversity and bringing in students of color, but there's not a lot of action behind it. When you look at the faculty, and you can pick any institution across the country, there's not a lot of diversity the higher you go, at associate, full professor, dean, vice presidents. There's very few. So when our institutions are saying one thing, but then on the other hand, they're, how do I do it? And you bring the numbers, you look at the numbers, you look at who's coming through the institutions, and, there's a lot of assumptions made. And I think at this point in our country where we're still seeing, Kelly was the first, woman of color. I think you said you were the first person of color. I was the first person of color in most of my positions. And you see that still happening. When you see a person of color who's like the first in a position, it's like, oh, wow. And, we're reposting it on Facebook because it's an anomaly, right? But it's not an anomaly. It's systemic. We have a systemic problem in our country that keeps the status quo white. And it's that whiteness that, John Paul from UC Berkeley talks about in terms of belonging. You're in there and you're fighting and you're fighting and you're trying to make changes, and then you just get burnt out, and it's like, I gotta go. I gotta go somewhere else. I got burnt out being in the academy. And so now I'm leading an organization that's working specifically with women of color, specifically. And when I did that, this is a 22-year-old organization, and I'll talk about that more tomorrow in my session, but when I came in 2 years ago, I said, this is our focus. This is what we're gonna do. And there was a lot of very unhappy people, a lot. And you kind of wonder, with all the resources for for other folks, and then you look at the lack of resources there are for women of color, particularly Black and brown-skinned women of color. And you start initiatives and you start programs that start to meet that need, and you don't have the support, that you think you would have, right? Because we all know, like intellectually, we all know what's happening, but then the practice is something completely different. So I think I'll leave it there, and I know we'll talk more about this as we talk later.
Thank you, thank you. So when I was talking to Kelly when we were getting ready for this panel, we were very clear that nobody's racist. Everybody knows that, right? Nobody's racist. Those are the hardest discussions to have. People may claim a certain bias, but nobody ever claims that they actually have any sort of racism operating. So we're talking about looking at the organizations that she works with, and as she integrates, equity, using all their facilitation skills. And what does she see across the sector? Like to talk about what do you see across the sector? What are the common struggles, the unrealized assets within the organization? And what have you found to be important and helpful in terms of the first steps in that kind of identification and discovery phase? So to talk about in terms of, because they work with organizations all across the sector, so to kind of address that.
Yeah, first, let me just get a sense. How many of you have been involved in initiatives around diversity, inclusion, and equity throughout the years? Just show of hands. And for the live stream, that's pretty much 95 to 100% of the room. How many of you experienced joy through that process? Maybe 30%. How many of you experienced a lot of pain through that process? Okay, yeah, we're getting closer to like 70%. How many of you started the work by going through like a training, where you were exposed to different concepts or different ideas? Okay, that's a good part of the room as well. I want to talk about the evolution of the field because it's really shifted, and I think you all will relate to this. But it was really important for us to think about how has this field shifted. So I want to have a slide go up that I think will help set some context for the work that we engage with organizations and that you've been a part of. So in terms of the field, even though there's been a lot of work around DEI and racial justice and civil rights long before, the 60s, but this is where I'm going to start. If you remember back in the day, back in the 60s and early 70s, if you look in that corner there, it was all about equal employment opportunity, right, and affirmative action. It was about how do we take discrimination out of the law, out of laws, right, which we know is still a challenge, and how do we, make sure that people are actually understand their legal remedies for this, right? And so in the early day, it was about helping people understand the laws. But we weren't really thinking about culture, we weren't thinking about bias, we weren't thinking about our own awareness, we weren't looking at leadership, we weren't looking at those questions. Then we moved, if you think about it, in I would say maybe the 80s, 90s, the conversation shifted to diversity and inclusion, right? And it became about, who's here, who's not here, and it was about the numbers, right? And we looked very broadly at diversity, and it was about like getting people to the table, recruiting more people of color, or more women, or more people with disabilities, and thinking about maybe we might make sure they have more access to opportunities throughout the organization. And it was about inclusion. How do we make sure everyone feels a sense of welcoming, a sense of belonging? And that was important work. And this is when we started to do a lot of like diversity training, right? And still a very important equation to this work, but what we found and what Interaction Institute found is that that was great and it set some level of awareness, but it actually did a lot of harm. Because you'd go in, right? You'd work with people like us. We'd go in, we'd come out, we'd say, goodbye, see you later, you've got this. And you didn't have this because it's complex. How do you change an organization that's built up a set of practices of inequity over many decades and root that out and deal with all the interpersonal questions, all the awareness building? So we are starting to understand that even though those trainings are important, it's not enough. And so we started to move from there, and you start to remember some conversations about cultural competency. And this was about like, okay, let's learn about different cultures and what they need, and let's understand that. And that was important, right? It's important to know when you're working with a Haitian population or a Haitian community what's unique, right? Versus working in a community of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans who are working together. But that was sort of like, I felt a little like cultural gazing, like, oh, how wonderful, cultures are great. But it didn't really have a power analysis of what's happening in institutions. And so what we've seen in this last 5 years, I would say, or more, is a deep understanding that we also need to be looking at questions of equity, questions of power, who has power in the organization and who doesn't, how is power generated, how is power held onto, how is power shared, and also looking at life outcomes, right? Looking at racial disparities, looking at how the quality of our policies and practices can help people have better lives, and really looking at impacts. And also inequities across your institution, within your own organization. How do your own policies and practices and ways of being create harm, create disparate impacts? And then looking at structural inequity. How do different institutions, when they work together, foster inequity or equity? So how does the criminal justice system intersect with education, intersect with healthcare, intersect with communities, and create problems around race, problems around gender, et cetera, for our communities? That's deeply where a lot of the conversation is situated now. So now when we go into systems, we can talk about diversity, we can talk about inclusion and cultural competency, but now the rubber's meeting the road around how is power being shared or not, and how are we actually rooting out inequities in our practice and walking it, right? Not having all the answers, but having a level of vulnerability and a level of analysis that allows us to really do deep-rooted work. Where we're heading is around liberation, freedom from these confines that all of us have been placed under, and thinking about how do we create change across systems and across networks. Like, if all of us had a way to align and think about our strategies around this, right, it would be deeper. It would have accelerated impact. So that's what we're talking more about. And also how we look at questions of healing and restoration. When you go through these kinds of pains, as you said before, and Joyce, there's a lot of repair that needs to be done. There's a lot of work that we need to do to recapture our humanity. And most people these days are not satisfied with the way our work environments are, and it's not working for anybody, frankly, folks. And so how do we restore, how do we create different ways of operating together so that we can play, and we can have art, and we can have change? And if you look at the next slide, if you go forward, not to this next slide, but two ahead, one more back. Thank you. We talked about equality at one point in our history. Many people, if we all have the same height of a box, we'll all have the same experiences and outcomes. We realized that wasn't necessarily true. Not everybody had the same outcomes and opportunities. So we talk about equity and like, okay, some people might need, one or two boxes. But ultimately, liberation is those boxes are gone, you can see the field, you're in there, and you're sharing power, you're living, and you're living your life. Well, what's on the other side of that box? When we've asked people that question, play, love, family, like that's the aim now, is to think bigger and beyond ourselves so that everybody can have this like beautiful, liberated life that we're really looking toward. So now the way we're trying to change the conversation at Interaction Institute for Social Change, working with our clients and our systems, is about how do you really think about undoing those inequities in your organization and having a mindset for liberation that goes beyond what you think you can possibly achieve. And it's not necessarily linear. When we work with organizations, we'll assess how you're doing. We co-design a process with you of engagements to pull you out of this process of inequity. But ultimately, we have to leave tools behind. And ultimately, you have to just walk it, and try things that you haven't before. Now we're working with systems saying, try experiments. Don't try to change everything and say, if we line this up, we're going to be able to do this in 20 years. Put your feet into something and try something unique and see if it can hold and change the system so that while you're doing that, other things can dismantle. So one of the things that we're trying to help people understand in the sector is this work is never done. And that's the hard part. I think people feel like if we have that training, if we do a process over some years, it's going to be complete. And I think the hard part is that we are never really undone, because there's always constant shifts and challenges in a system, and the system tries to revert back. It will, get used to a new reality, and then it will try to bring you back. So to just think about how can we be continuing to move forward even as these challenges are, ahead of us. The last thing I'll just say is this work is increasingly taking more vulnerability and a lot more courage. People in my business and my practice now are having to learn not just how to facilitate trainings and meetings and engagements and work with caucuses and affinity groups around difference. People are asking us to help them work through the emotional difficulties of this work. So we can no longer come into rooms and say, here's the agenda, let's go. Like, we have to stop and pause and work with a lot of courage and ask you to have courage so that we can get to change. Because the power doesn't shift if people just hold on to, I have figured this out, and there's no emotions in this. There's a lot of emotions in this. And Brene Brown, if you haven't checked out her TED Talk, she's a dynamo, and she talks about that the next critical role for leaders is actually to have vulnerability. That is what's going to take us to the next chapter of the work that we're trying to do. So I'll just stop there, but the field is evolving. We're moving in a lot of ways that we haven't before, and we're being called and you're being called to do a lot more deeper work than when we started this journey. But that's a good thing, right? Remember, some of us remember back in the day when we started this work. It is shifting, it's getting deeper, and we're finally looking at root causes of problems and really restoring our communities and our lives. And again, that's, I think, the vision.
Thank you, Kelly. So when I think of the theology of liberation, so part of the struggle is thinking about it from how do you actually achieve liberation in a certain socioeconomic context. So that's probably something we probably have to discuss more. Like how, and the reality for nonprofits is that they're tied to funding. And so what will actually our liberation look like, in a sense? But we can continue to discuss that, because you always say it's evolving, right? So Shahir, we wanted to think about what as you work with a lot of practitioners, right? And thinking about, you're the ED of a community-based organization. So how do you see like the high-level aspiration for folks to grow into a more diverse and equitable community play out on the front line in terms of the work that you're doing with Hopewell?
So first of all, our tagline at Hopewell is care and action. And at the end of the day, I think it's really all about behavior and actions. Words can only get us so far, but it's really our behavior is really ultimately what we're going to be judged upon. And I did not coordinate this with Kelly, and she talked about being vulnerable, but I'm going to be vulnerable for a minute. And I think this idea of action-oriented change comes from my own history with addiction. And when I was in detox, I had all the ideas on being sober. I could say all the right things. I knew all the ins and outs of that, but I was not sober. So, I think talk is cheap on some level, and at the end of the day, you gotta live it, and you have to be it. So that's what we try to do at Hopewell. And we rebranded our organization a couple years ago, and even the name that we have is really intentional. So hope, right? So Brian Stevenson talks about believing in things that we've not yet seen. And when I think about young people in foster care, and I think of some of the disparate outcomes, we believe in the possibility of success for all the young people that we serve. So we hold that hope for them. And also, the word well, it has two meanings. And one is that it's a source, like a spring, right? Like a well from the ground. Another one is to do something with rigor and to do something well, right? It's a discipline. So being hopeful doesn't really get us very far. But if we do that and we point that in a direction with discipline, now we're talking. So for me, it's really all about the action. And so I just want to share a little bit with you guys about the outcomes for young people in foster care. I think that's critically important to help ground the conversation. So I don't know if people know this, but when young people exit the foster care system, nearly half will be homeless within 1 year of exiting the foster care system. 3 out of 4 young men who experience the foster care system at any point in their life will be arrested or incarcerated by the time they are 24 years old, 75%. And less than 5% will complete a post-secondary degree. So think about that for a minute. And we talk about, I don't like to use the word vulnerable because I think it is a loaded term, but I've yet to come up with another one that really captures this. But young people in foster care are a very vulnerable population. So that's something that I try to stay connected with on a daily basis. And at the end of the day, they need our support now. They can't be waiting for our support because every single day, young people are becoming homeless, young people are becoming incarcerated, young people are being harmed and abused. So at the end of the day, that talk is not really getting us where we need to be. We need to start with action. So at my organization, that's what grounds everything that we do. So we have over 200 employees, 300 foster parents across 2 states. But the one thing that unites all of us in our work is that we will run through walls on behalf of the kids that we serve. So that's where we start, right? And so then we have to be connected and committed around a common purpose. And that's shifting the outcomes for young people in foster care. And there's some ways that we've done that. So for example, there's a lot of things that we could be focused on, but the one thing that we've decided to kind of cull out is education. So I just went through some really horrible statistics for young people in foster care, and I'll just give you another one. So for every placement that a young person changes in foster care, they lose 6 months of academic performance. So if a young person goes through, say, 8 placements, they're going to lose 4 years of academic performance, which is just unacceptable, right? So in human service organizations, we don't typically think of human service organizations as bastions of innovation and creativity, right? We just don't. But that's, again, we don't accept that. Our young people deserve us, they require us to be innovative and to not accept the status quo. So we actually partnered with an organization based in Oakland, First Place for Youth. They've been doing this work for about 20 years, working with young people who age out of the foster care system, and they've developed a brilliant model. It's a housing first model called My First Place. It's a scattered site apartment model, and it's an education and employment program, but it uses stable housing, right, as the foundation, the bedrock, so that young people can pursue their academic pursuits and their economic opportunity. So we could have had an ego about this. We could have built our own program. We could have said, no, we're going to do this, but we didn't. There was an organization that was already doing this really well, and thankfully they were willing partners, and we've brought the program here to Boston. And so now we've served 35 young people so far in the past year, and we're looking to grow and scale that to ultimately change some of those statistics and some of those outputs. And then we're working further upstream. So we are working with young people who are currently in foster care around their educational attainment. So we are in probably the world's epicenter of higher learning, right? We have tremendous universities and colleges around us. And there's not a lot of research going into kids in foster care. So we've kind of called some of our institutions out on that. So why are you not focusing on that? So we've been able to partner with Harvard's Graduate School of Education and Dr. Savitz Romer, who's done a lot of research around post-secondary access and success. Not just access, but success. And so we're working upstream with our foster parents and our staff to use an equity lens around educational attainment for youth in foster care. So there's just a couple concrete things that we're doing. And then to kind of zoom out, we want to focus on our programs and on our impact, but we also need to remember that we're an organization with 200 people, and that's our most valuable resource, frankly, right? We're not making widgets, we're not a factory, right? The people doing the work is critically important, so we need to invest in them. So there is something about representative diversity that's important. So as a person of color leading the organization, I think that is really important. At the Children's League, where I'm the vice chair, there's 80 organizations represented. 2 are led by people of color, myself being one. And if you think about literally the hundreds of thousands of families that are served by those organizations, and there are 2 people of color leading those organizations. So that is important. When I came on board, our board of directors, I was one of 2 people of color, because I'm a board member on my organization. So we brought 2 new board members on, both people of color, both with lived experience in the foster care system. That was critically important. So having that representation is really important as well. but then also investing in our staff. So one thing that we've done is we have created an unconditional tuition repayment program. So I don't care if you got your bachelor's in fine arts, it doesn't matter. If you're working in our organization from day one, you can get up to $3,600 towards your student loans. And it starts on day one. You don't have to go through some sort of approval process. You don't have to be working for us for a year. We just say, you know what? If you're doing this work, you shouldn't have to live in poverty to serve your community. So again, these are just some of the things that we do as an organization, and really trying to tie it into concrete action and behaviors.
Thank you. So the other remaining question, I think, is sometimes we think that sometimes it's framed that having people of color leading organizations somehow then will have some impact on all this disparity. and so to think about that, and let's talk about that after Sonia's presentation. But that's another question that we have, like actually, does actually having people of color lead an organization have some real impact on what that disparity is that we're trying to address? And Sonia is, doing so much work with leaders of color, especially women in Oakland, California. And I'm really wanting to think about with you and have you talk about some of that work, and also how does that play out? Because it's race, it's gender, as we talked about, it's race, it's gender, it's this whole intersectionality, and what does that look like for you? How do you address it? How do you, what interventions do you come up with? How do you work really with these people of color in that respect?
Thank you. One thing I just want to say that your question, if you have an organization that's led by a person of color, does that kind of change, change the demographics, change what's happening, and it doesn't. And it doesn't because we are working in systems that were not developed for us to succeed. The whole nonprofit industrial complex system is not a system that lends itself for success, for not only for leaders of color, but for the communities and the constituents that are being served. So a lot of our framing is from a systems theory perspective. It's about systems change. How do we change the systems in which we're working in order to make an impact on the communities that we're serving? So, for example, someone that ages out of foster care at 18 and they're on their own. What 18-year-old knows what to do on their own? I mean, I knew a young man who, when he was 18, his foster parents are like, we're done. And he was out on the street, So what type of system does that, right? So what we're doing, Leader Spring has been working with executive directors in the nonprofit sector for the last 22 years. And, everything from youth, education, social services, health, you name it. It runs the gamut. And we've primarily been working throughout the state of California, which is very, very large. And so we have served probably close to 500 executive directors, not exclusively executive directors of color, but primarily. The last 2 years, we've decided to focus specifically on women of color. And we've really looked at the curriculum that we weren't engaging these leaders in, and it's a 2-year fellowship. It's a monthly, 1 full-day meeting, and 3 multiple-day retreats off-site. One at the beginning, one at the end of the first year, and then one at the end of the second year. And then there's a study trip that we subsidize for the EDs to go, anywhere nationally or internationally to learn from another either person, ED, or organization that they feel that they want to study from to conclude the fellowship. But one thing that we found is that we were sending our executive directors with all of this knowledge about change, about systems change, about self-care, back into the systems that were not functioning well. And so were we doing them a service or a disservice? So we decided to refocus a curriculum on systems change and how can you as a leader with your board, and we do board summits around equity, diversity, and inclusion, how can you then begin to develop systems that work for you within your organization? And that's hard because funders, you know, they don't like a whole lot of change. You know, they like to fund what works for them, what's safe. You know, so if you begin to say, we're gonna implement a different type of structure where there's shared leadership as opposed to hierarchical leadership, we're going to have a board that is primarily representative of the communities that we serve. We are going to look at fundraising and donorship in a different way. You know, a lot of times the funders are like, well, what are you talking about? This is, you know, how is this gonna work? And I've started to do this with my own organization in the last 2 years, and there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of pushback because people, you know, you're working outside of the norm. We've also started working with emerging leaders, not just executive directors, you know, because you have to think about a lot of these executive directors have been in their organizations for many years, and there's no bench, you know, there's no succession planning, so that when they leave, it cripples the organization. And funders have that kind of wait and see attitude. We're not gonna support the new ED coming in because we wanna wait and see what he or she is gonna do. And particularly if this new ED is coming in with a lot of change, which I think is good, you know, then that further kind of puts this red mark on the organization because they really wanna, well, wait a minute, we're used to this way of being. We're used to what this executive director was doing. So in the fellowship, we're really working, we have this amazing group of 18 women throughout the greater Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond, Hayward, Contra Costa County, and which is the first that we've had. We used to have geographic specific fellowships, but what's really wonderful about this is that these women have formed a learning community, and they're really testing things out, and they're testing out what change looks like. And they're bringing their board presidents into the process of saying, we have to do this differently. And they're doing it with a lot of support from LeaderSpring and with a lot of support from each other. You know, and that's what it takes. It takes us coming together saying, hey, let's really work together. You know, we say that, we meet each other. It's like, oh, you know, I like what you're doing. Yeah, let's talk. How can we collaborate? But then we go back into our silos because there's so much work to do, you know, and collaboration takes time. It takes coming to the table, you know, being vulnerable, you know, breaking down what you do, and how can we really maximize our efforts and work together. And it's hard, but it's good work. I led a collaboration 12 years ago when I was at the California College of the Arts with a group of about 26 community-based organizations around family. It was called 100 Families Oakland Art and Social Change. And just the work to get these organizations to talk to each other, it took us a year before we even did the first program. A year, because you have to build trust. And you can't trust each other until you get to know each other. And you don't know each other until you spend time with each other, real time. You know, meals, you know, your families coming together. And it was a lot of work, but at the end of the day, what we were able to do in Oakland, reaching 500 families around art and social change, was amazing. So I got my 1 minute mark. I think I'll leave it there and hand it back over to John.
Thank you, Sana. So I want to to go back, Kelly, to this idea of liberation, right? And I'm sorry. I want to go back to this idea of liberation and have you all think about this and talk about it a little bit more. Like, how do you actually achieve that within organizations, given the systems and structures and limitations that we all just discussed, in a sense, and the inequities that exist?
We're working really different with organizations now. We are now working with organizations who are ready and committed to working like 3 to 10 years with us. And it is making big shifts. So we go into the system partnering as working with the client system as co-designers with us. And the first thing we do is we don't do like an audit. Remember, some of you, like back in the day, there were diversity audits, and you look at everything in the organization and the consultant says, here's a report, go do it. We don't operate like that anymore. Not effective, no buy-in. How do you know the consultant's right? So now we do ask the organization, how ready are you? Where have you been? Where do you want to go? How do you think you should get there? And then we co-design with a slice of stakeholders throughout the organization, and we actually design a multi-year process of engagement and interventions to shift the entire culture and the entire organization. There might be various facilitated conversations that the organization might need to have. There might be work groups around policies or practices. There might be various kinds of research the organization wants to do. There might be a conflict resolution process they want to put in place. And also we talk about, as we build that process, what are the practices you want to start practicing now in how you actually show up for each other? Because that is what liberation looks like. For example, if you say, you know, we want to share power, we want more power distributed across the organization, okay, well, how do you step into that like tomorrow? What does that look like? And we will share skills and tools, but we'll ask them to think about that. And then we say, how's it going? As we're working through those years with them. And it often starts at the top. Like, we do a lot of coaching with the leaders at the top of the organization. Like, are you ready to be vulnerable? Are you ready to say where you've made a mistake? Are you ready to share power? What does that look like? What could be the value of doing that for you? Oh, you mean you wouldn't be as tired? You mean there'd be more shared leadership? You'd mean there'd be creativity? And all of a sudden, the system starts to relax a little. And you start to see like liberatory sets of practices where people start to value relationship sometimes more over results, if their results are strong. They start to be in like deep respect and relationship with one another. People start hiring from their values and hiring people who are really committed deeply to equity. And in our case, we work with organizations that are particularly interested in looking at racial equity. So they start to really embed a whole way of being and culture into the practice. And you know, when you do work with an organization 4, 5, 6 years, like, stuff does shift. It does. And it may not be perfect, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. It can be powerful to do these kinds of processes when a founder's about to leave, or an executive director's about to leave, or there's new leadership. But the days of like waiting for people to like unionize, sue, get angry, like that's not working. Like, we have to be doing this because we understand that it's fundamental to us achieving our mission, and also for the lives we want to lead, right? Like, we work in nonprofits because like we believe in being together, right? We believe in community. We believe in our lives are all intertwined. So that's when, you know, there's like that feeling of like exhale in an organization. It doesn't mean that there's not times of deep distrust and deep divide and tension. And we help people walk through that, you know, to the other side.
Thank you so much. Shohei or anybody?
What's the question again?
I thought you had asked that. We were talking about liberation. But you're saying she answered it. We want to open it up to see if there are any questions from the audience. There's been a lot to sort of take in.
Can I just make one comment about
Sure.
liberation? I think liberation happens when there's no longer a need for nonprofits.
So everybody's going to lose their job, is what you're saying.
No, we'll just go on and do other things. We'll recreate ourselves, right?
You have a
organizations.
My name is Tony, and that resonates with me so much because I have felt from the day I formed my organization that it is ridiculous that I have to have it. It is, you know, we down here below are constantly trying to address problems that are created by a system that is profoundly inequitable. And so how do we create equity when we live in a culture that just pushes inequity all the time? The burden is on us to change something that's, you know, shouldn't exist in the first place. So, you know, real burnout comes when you deeply understand that shit. Because honestly, it doesn't mean that then we're left with this place, people who have all the power, who basically have good hearts, say, oh, let me be philanthropic, because I have a good heart. I'm not motivated to change the system because it's working for me, but I do care about those people that are being hurt by the system that I benefit from. I just think it's, you know, we're constantly trying to better ourselves, be less this or more that, you know, get an A in equity. It's a lot of pressure on us to change a system that we didn't create, and we're trying to address the problems that are created by it. I guess this isn't really a question. It's more just I want to affirm what you say, and this is a real elephant in the living room in our lives.
Thank you. Anyone else? And I'm sorry for the live stream. I'm running all over, so.
My name is Nicolo Festa. And actually, this is a question that came from a public agency, but we both have worked for protective service agencies. I worked in the Texas Department of Protective and Regulatory Services in the administration and planning for adult protective services. It's fairly large, it's a big state, so it was a large program. The adult section had 7,000 employees. No, I'm sorry, the entire agency had 7,000. The adult, maybe 1,000. And we went through all the steps that you outlined at the beginning, you know, and got to the point there was a confluence of events, a threatened lawsuit from the feds, the inclusion of an African American as director of adult protective services, which is the section I was in. And so we did all the things with the checklist. It's funny to hear it all over again. And we did the checklist, and we were evaluated. And we made changes in policy and had trainings and diversity trainings and all that sort of stuff. One of the things, and I was charged with writing policy, which I consulted on, and worked closely with the director of my program. And then it got down to the point where integrating it into supervision. And honestly, that's where things all fell apart because, you know, no disrespect to the great state of Texas, however, we're talking about all of Texas. We're not talking about Austin or Houston. And I honestly was at a loss to how do you accomplish that? How do you, when you have like 100 supervisors across the state, how do you, and particularly, how do you ensure that the changes and the efforts towards equity and an understanding of the folks we're serving, it's just like we made the policy, we created the sort of atmosphere, we stated it as a value, we reviewed the policy, and then it came to the point of saying to the staff, okay, and I'm speaking specifically of supervisors, implement this stuff, and that's about as far as I could go, you know, except reminding them when you're sitting down with protective services cases, you have to really get the whole picture. So that's my question, I guess.
Well, I mean, that's a huge question, and I think there's, I'll try to see if I can offer any insights at all, but I mean, I think it's multifactorial, right? So if you're in receivership versus voluntarily opting into something, right? Like that's a key distinction, right? So if you're in receivership, then that's going to come with its own set of challenges, right? The extent to which it can be self-driven, I think is, if I were to default and pick one, that's the one I would tend to go for, right? But it's not always the case. But I think it's layered, right? So for me, it's really the extent that we can strive for alignment from top to bottom, and it's never going to be perfect, right? But from leadership and kind of the decree up top, like this is where we're going, but having it also be kind of circulated from the ground up is critically important. And you're never going to get that 100%, especially with a huge bureaucracy like what you're talking about. But at the end of the day, I would probably really try to connect it to the extent possible to measurables and metrics, because that's agnostic for the most part. If we're talking about certain, like if it was reducing disproportionate, I don't know what it would be in your specific circumstance, but if it was, disproportionate number of adoptions of African Americans versus their, white peers in Massachusetts, like that would be my equivalent, right? And that we would begin to track that and measure that, and then we'd be able to see, are there certain pockets where that's disproportionality is continuing, and then that's tied into performance evaluations, and it's tied into, like that would be the route I would go. It does run the risk of kind of like intellectualizing and kind of, I don't know, fitting right into that nonprofit industrial complex, but, and I'm just gonna deviate for 1 second, because I went to the IISC training on facilitating race dialogues, and this is a key distinction for me that I walked away with, and I'm gonna totally get the whole thing wrong, but basically, they talk about 4 different types of change. And there's like the 2 that stuck out to me. There's like the radical, right? Like what Tony was saying, like we got to just upend the system, come up with a whole new system, because the one we have is totally messed up. But then there's the reformer, right? Which is like we got to work within the system that we have because whatever, right? And oftentimes the reformer and the radical are like, well, you're not radical enough, and you're just the man, and and then the other one's like, well, you're a pie in the sky, and you're unrealistic, and you're crazy. So I think you have to kind of know where you are and what your situation is, and what's the best solution for that moment. In a state bureaucracy, I tend to lean towards reform, because I think if you're radical in that, nobody's gonna listen to you, and you'll just get shouted down. So that was a long-winded way, and I have no idea if that was helpful at all, but.
You did well. That was really good. I would also say in a large system where there's a lot of supervisors, what we found can also work well, in addition to the things you suggested, is having communities of practice. These are opt-in sessions, but they're really meaningful, where supervisors can come and lay their stuff at the door and say, here's what I'm struggling with, here's what's going on. And you also need a team to hold the whole change process. You can't have 1 or 2 people do it. So, and then I'm gonna say something a little controversial. You have to hire people from the beginning who have this orientation, and sometimes you have to let go of people who don't. Because the difference between strong leadership now and 30 years ago is really different, and you have to have people who understand the charge, that they are trying to come in, achieve the mission, root out these impacts, and they have to be really committed to it. And this is something that's hard, and we've had to do it in our organization. There are some people who it's not where their heart is, and maybe there's a good place for you somewhere else, but it's not here.
Yeah, it's creating a culture of change, and we can create policies and we can create practices. It doesn't change mindset, It's like until the person begins to see, his or her or their implicit biases, and really do that deep reflection work, which a lot of people in the workplace are not willing to do, particularly if they're social servants or in larger bureaucracies. But it's you have to really break down that culture and developing communities, networks, where people can really opt in. We're in conversations right now with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, which is a behemoth organization. And there are people in key positions that want to see change within that. And I'm telling them, this is not a strategic planning session. This is not a board retreat. This is not an executive leadership retreat. This is work that you have to commit to over time on various different levels. And if you're not willing to invest the time and the money into doing that over time, then you can continue to make your policies and, and say that we have practices of change, but it's not going to change the culture. I mean, that's a really deep ingrained culture.
Thank you, all three of you. So let's thank our panelists. We are at the end. Thank you, Shahir, for not hearing any of the questions, but providing your deep wisdom. Thank you, Sonia, for stepping in at the last minute because Safi couldn't be here. And thank you, Kelly, for being here the day before your birthday, that 50th birthday. It's really wonderful to be with all of them. We will transition now and have Trina come back. And again, thank you all, and we'll talk much more later. Thank you.